Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Could anyone sitting adjacent to an empty seat please put their hand up? There are quite a number of people. If you look for a hand, you should be able to find a seat, those of you who are at the back, if you'd like one. Come on to the front, towards the front. Quite a few over here on this side. Franklin, that's my seat. Okay. Right, I think we'll get started. Anyone else wanting a seat? There's one more I see sort of halfway back on this side. No? Okay, it looks like those people prefer to stand at the back, so that's fine. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for coming out this afternoon. My name is Lisa Oldham. I'm the director of New Canaan Library, and I am incredibly proud and pleased to welcome you to tonight's event. As you all will be aware, this is an event that is put on by an incredible committee, our Stoddard Art Committee, who work throughout the year to organize a speaker and work along with our program librarian, Erin, to make sure that this comes off without a hitch. As many of you will know, one of the key people in the committee suddenly and very sadly passed away just before we got to the event. Judy Dunn will speak after me, and she'll speak more about Mr. Findlay. In any case, this is one of our cornerstone events in the year, as you all know. There are two others we normally have in the fall, and I wanted to take this opportunity to let you know that both our Salant and our UN Anita Houston lecturers have very suddenly let us know they won't be coming. Unfortunately, the famous epidemiologist from Melbourne, Australia, who is to be our lecturer for the UN lecture later this year, has had an accident and can't fly, so we'll be rebooking him for next year. And our Salant speaker, who I won't name because we are desperately trying to find another date, has been unable to come next month as planned. So as soon as we get word on when he can come, we'll be putting that back on the docket, so do look out for that. Thank you all, and without further ado, I welcome Judy Dunn of the Stoddard Art Committee to come and welcome our speaker.
Thank you. This is so great. It's so wonderful to see all of you. I'm so glad you're here. However, as you know, this past month, we unfortunately lost a great friend, a dear friend to this library, a past board member and great supporter, and who is David Findlay Jr. And he was an integral member of the Stoddard Art Lecture Committee. His experience and knowledge of the art community brought to us most of our guest lecturers, as is the case today. While I was thinking of how to give a warm welcome and an introduction to Mr. Perrell, Lee Findlay Potter, David's daughter, sent a letter to the committee, a lovely letter to be shared, and my quest was answered. She writes, and I will read part of it to you. He, David, loved working with the library's art committee to find a speaker for the Stoddard lecture that would bring to the New Canaan community an educational, broadening, and exciting topic. He particularly liked to find speakers with an interest in modern art, subjects such as Wendy Jeffers, with her talk on Dorothy Miller and the Museum of Modern Art. When Dad identified Franklin Perrell as the speaker for this lecture, his blue eyes twinkled and his charismatic smile broadened. What he found in Franklin was a scholar who would take you on a fabulous journey into the challenging, innovative, and beautiful work and world of American modernism and leave you with a new appreciation for the artists and their work of the early 20th century. Oh, how Dad would have enjoyed this lecture. So, with great anticipation, and I might add, after an unusually difficult trip up here, we do give a very warm welcome to Franklin Perrell.
Thank you. That was certainly a lovely, lovely introduction, and I very much regret that David's not with us today to enjoy this. We will enjoy it together. But in any event, our topic, Edward Hopper, seems a little bit of an atypical designation within the heading of American modernism. Don't we all think of Edward Hopper as the leading realist in 20th century art? But I think that for those of us who are thinking about modernism, he's the realist who passes muster. And for those of us who are not especially interested in the modernist ethos, he's an artist of indisputable attraction. And I propose to share with you a little bit about his life and his art, and also to suggest how it might lead to a better understanding of what we think of as modernism. So let's look at this portrait, self-portrait of Edward Hopper, done in 1906. He's 24 years old at this point. He is making his living as an illustrator. This period of 1900 till really 1940 or so, even 50, is called the golden age of illustration, in which people like Norman Rockwell and Maxfield Parrish, N.C. Wyeth, are all at the pinnacle of fame. They're all earning princely livelihoods, probably in terms of the social approval of the day, rather like Warhol did in the 80s, or Jeff Koons does in the 2000s. They would be regarded as people who were in the realm of art, but they're sort of up there, respectable in every way. And I think for somebody like Hopper, the aspiration of being an illustrator was perfectly fitting for someone of his orientation, background, and ideals. In 1906 was one of 3 years in the time when he was in his 20s that he visited Paris. And he visited Paris with a secret agenda, and that was the idea to try out what it would be like to be a fine artist. I hesitate to say a real artist, but a fine artist who was not being paid by the assignment. I think the thing with an illustrator is that an illustrator will be given a project which will be to portray a given theme, to use their art to tell a story or to sell a product. And for the fine artist, it's a matter of painting out something that interests you as an artist, and it becomes a vehicle for self-expression, whatever that might amount to in its various ways. Hopper says, "I don't think I ever tried to paint the American scene. I'm trying to paint himself." And later on, when he did achieve fame, and there were those who compared him to Rockwell, he didn't take that particularly well. And the notion of the American scene is one of the several categories of art in the 1930s that would have been deemed a commonplace mode of expression. American scene means that the artist is painting a region of which they're very familiar, usually a place where they live or their place of origin. There are rural regionalists painting the countryside, and there are urban realists painting the cities. Usually the city painters tended to introduce points of societal contention. They were often ideologically driven, thinking that such attitudes as communism and socialism were virtuous. The people labored in factories were heroes, and bankers and capitalists were sort of the bad guys. And life was a point of an argument between these two groups for dominance, in which the likes of Sacco and Vanzetti become martyrs for the cause of labor. That's the typical social realist, urban realist attitude. The rural regionalist is somebody like Thomas Hart Benton or John Stewart Curry painting Kansas or Missouri and showing the glories of cotton farming or tobacco or whatever one grows in these places. So, and in the 30s, FDR was in charge. He had his WPA program. For people in the art world, they think that WPA is all about them, but we know better. WPA built hospitals, roads. It put people to work in conservation. It built there was the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Hoover Dam, and all of that. Infrastructure, putting America back to work. Well, Hopper doesn't fit in with any of that. He had no ideology in his art. He had no singular notion of anybody who was particularly evil or particularly good. He wasn't interested in furthering the cause of the poor or the rich, and he had no agenda. He had that idea, like the Impressionists, that the vision that he had attracted his interest personally, and he wanted to paint it. And often people would look at his paintings and they would see a story there. And he'd say, well, what interested me was the sunlight. And you will find some amazing consistencies in his work. But let's talk a little bit about his origins. He comes from Nyack, New York, on the Hudson River, not too far from New York City. It's in Rockland County, but not especially far away. And Hopper's father supported the family after a fashion till he was about 41 or 42 years old, running a dry goods store. Mrs. Hopper was a local heiress. She had a couple of commercial properties on the main street and owned a few rental houses, and Mr. Hopper eventually felt he would be better advised just living on the fat of the land. And that was the setting in which Edward Hopper was brought up, a mixture of public and private schools going on. And what really captivated his attention was the opportunity to take a ferry to Manhattan every Saturday morning and study at the Art Students League, which led him to go to school with at the atelier run by William Merritt Chase and eventually Robert Henry, and then take study at the school which was the precursor of Parsons, in which ultimately he became proficient in illustration art. The family was not sufficiently affluent, nor were they of a mindset to tell their son, oh yes, go off to Paris and be an artist and let's see what happens. No, they said if you want to pursue art, you must make a living from it. So that's how this commercial art idea got going. Now, Hopper is born in 1882. He is, by 1902, he's 20 years old, and at that point, actually a year or so later, he is really making a good living, and he keeps a stock book, an account book from day one. Right away he's making $1,000 to $1,500 a year, and I think if those of you have some sense of economics going back, he was doing a little better than average. Not phenomenally, but respectably. And it gave him a great sense of satisfaction to be self-supporting, but he had no doubt that he would be. And he received all sorts of assignments for magazine covers and the like, but all along harboring an understanding of fine art as he understood it and pursuing it. And all along while he was doing his illustrations, he was going back and forth. He made 3 trips to Paris, which were his sabbaticals, and he would find the means to stay away. You know, he was a freelance artist, which meant he acted as his own agent. He had a number of clients whom he could count on. They might be detective magazines, they might be commercial advertising, and so on. And when he chose not to work at it, it would reflect a moment when he had saved up enough that he knew he could take one of these European trips. Well, by around 1920, he had accumulated enough work that he started to consider selling and showing work that was not within the spectrum of his commercial productivity. And we have a piece here, a painting, 1921, that's a little bit before that, but we're already right now seeing a little bit of the Hopper that we will get to know later. And in this respect, this girl at a sewing machine, I wonder, do you think, is there any point for us to turn the lights down a teeny bit? I think we're looking at art now. I think that might not be such a bad idea. Those people with the flat screens in the back, they're already doing quite well, but the likes of us up front need a little support here in terms of the light modification. I noticed something. I've looked at Hopper most of my life, and only today I had a revelation, and you can test this. And that is, I don't know whether there's any significance to it at all, but I've noticed, at least in all the pictures I've chosen, if there is outdoor lighting, it's almost always coming in from the right. If there is indoor lighting, it's ambient and it might be coming in from the left, but not so distinctly from the right. And I was a little surprised. You know, one can look at paintings a long time and not notice certain things. Well, there it is. So in any event, this one very much reminds me of what his colleagues, John Sloan and Robert Henry, might do as members of the Ashcan School. And that is, they often took a great interest in the lives of laboring people and the personality and the humanism of the person who labors. But as I say, I don't think that's Hopper's focus. He's really, even here, interested in the sunlight. Now, at this point, Hopper has not sold a painting. He doesn't know he's going to be making exhibitions of paintings. He probably is not even especially acquainted with the whole system of galleries and collectors and all of that. That will come later. But this idea of a singular figure in a room whose ambience in a way dwarfs that figure and whose pattern of light produces a type of an abstraction. You see that already? You see those shapes that are on the wall? You almost always will have that in Hopper. And another thing that's peculiar in this painting is look at the piece of furniture to the left. Now, I don't know enough about Victorian furniture to say for sure it's an Eastlake piece, but I sort of think so. You know, one gets the sense of a marble top. A little bit after Abraham Lincoln period, one would get a sense that this work had a little bit of carving on it and all that, and it's this wood oak which has this sort of orangish stain on it, possibly, I don't really know. But you've got a machine there, you've got somebody at work, she's got a chair, there's a piece of furniture, and there's a contrast between the structural elaboration of that rather, I guess, fanciful Victorian piece and the geometric pattern of the windows with the figure and the machine as a foil in terms of design between those two things. And here we are, 1927. Now, by now, he's gotten a little bit of traction as an artist. I'll tell you what's happened between 20 and 27. Hopper begins to make some headway with reaching out to collectors and into exhibitions through his etchings, through prints. When you go to the big museum shows, you don't often see a lot of prints, but if you know private collectors who have Hopper, you might be aware that there are very few oils around. But he has a few classic works in his etchings, and that was how he first gained success with the public. And by 1927, he had linked up with Mrs. Whitney, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. I must tell you I'll tell you more about her later. But in 27, she had an institution that was called the Whitney Studio Club. And her artists whom she patronized were chiefly the ashcan painters. I'll have a painting to illuminate that later. But what that really means are the artists who painted the streets of New York. And they were not very fancy in terms of their aspirations. They were not looking for allegories about gods and goddesses. And once again, they were not working on any grandiose ideologies or other points. They painted the scene around them. I suppose in a way, Hopper fits into this a little bit in what he does, and his affiliation and his affinity, having been a student of Robert Henry and closely friendly with John Sloane, puts him in the orbit to be one of Mrs. Whitney's circle at that point. And what she did for the artists was she would provide hospitality for them. She was an artist herself, a sculptor. She had a studio in Greenwich Village, and her parties and fraternizing with her was so popular, it didn't hurt that she bought people's work. But she had 500 paintings over the course of time that she accumulated in this manner. But the main thing was conviviality and hospitality, and ultimately it got so out of hand she couldn't handle the people in her own studio, and she bought a building behind and set up something like, if you've been in New York to the Salmagundi Club, the legendary artist club in Greenwich Village, that's a working artist club. That's what this was. You went there and you could set up an easel, there'd be a spot for that, and you would have sketching over there. But the most exciting thing is they would make exhibitions. So she made the very first show for Edward Hopper in 1927. Exemplified by the work in front of you here, the automat, which is now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And again, you have a figure here, and look at the geometry of this. Look at the styling of this. The rounded image of her hat, the rounded areas in the fruit on the table, the oval tabletop, now it's very simplified, the oval lights in the ceiling, creating a line of perspective, and all of those round forms set off by the strong verticals to the left and the rectangular cube-like form of the radiator and the structure of the chair, which bridges the two things. It's not quite straight and not quite rounded. So he's a really good designer. He puts things together in such a way, and his eye would have told him these things are good to look at. Where I'm going with this is that underneath all of this, Hopper is a type of abstract painter. It's very confusing because it's embedded in the work, and that's what makes his work appeal to the people who feel you're moving away from realism. He's a realist in every way, and yet his structure and his interest is not pure storytelling. You can find an awfully good story in there if you like. You wonder what this woman is doing. Is she a job applicant? Has she finished a long day at work? Why doesn't she have friends with her? You can ask all sorts of questions about this. But it's also so open-ended. Illustration art tells you right away. You feel sorry for the person, it was a disaster, a tragedy, it's happy. You know right away. When people look at Hopper's paintings, they don't know for sure. Is it loneliness? Is it calm? Is it relaxation? Is she perhaps relieved to be there and pleased to be there? Some see a downcast expression, others see something different. And you read the painting not so much because of the narration of the position of a given person who's clearly a protagonist who gives you a pretext to create a story. But it's a story you write the script. And this is the famous chop suey, two women in a Chinese restaurant with the signage. And look at how that looks forward to Robert, Indiana, and Roy Lichtenstein and pop art and Jasper Johns, putting in words and letters as a dominant design. And of course, one might argue it just happened to have been there. But Hopper, when you do these types of paintings, an artist, remember, can put themselves anywhere in a room. And I contend that Hopper would have a sense of a composition that would interest him. And to be sure, adding those letters creates a whole different realm of shapes and design for us to look at. And also, we have two different groups. We have two women together, again with those flapper-era hats, which create such a great shape, and then a singular man in a business suit behind him. And look at the way the patterning through the windows is very uncertain. We're not exactly sure what the light source in that back window is. You see that diagonal, the parallelogram in white that creates a triangle wedge chevron of blue. And then you look to the right. And while colors in, I'm happy now with digital because your color reproduction is much better. And I think we can see one of the things that Hopper learned from the Impressionists was the mix of color. When Hopper makes a shadow, it's blue and green and yellow and red in various quantities, so that the color is not just a tone of gray or black, but it's pure Impressionist color. And that's a premise that sets him apart, certainly from his colleagues in the illustration mode, because those were what those visits to Paris brought about. And here's a painting that has no one in it, no person. The implication of a person, but becomes in a way a building portrait. It's the shape of a building that seems to have eyes, those windows at the top, and it seems to have a hairdo or a hat with that triangle, and it has a torso or a body with the shape, the vertical shape in that rectangle, and it stands in a way as such a watchtower might be, a type of a sentry, and waiting for the train. And it also, we have this moment when the sky is infused with all of this fabulous color. And the design here of Hopper identifying this cloud formation and selecting this moment to highlight where the clouds are such a deliberate echo, creating an exact parallel to the lines of the mountains and the presentation of the railroad tracks, which pick up a wonderful glowing pink light reflecting the ambient light from the sky. Hopper divided I've just been hearing that, I was told a moment ago, that if you visit the area of Hopper's vacation house in Truro in Cape Cod, you might have the opportunity now. Apparently they have people who will give you tours of looking at all the sites in the vicinity that Hopper painted. And his lighthouse at Two Lights is one of those famous sites. And look here how the complexities of the gingerbread architecture, that little bit of trim underneath the gables of the roof, versus the detailing in the balcony of the lighthouse, create such interest. And the scale of the whole thing, the natural flow of the topography, the flow of it is echoed by the rhythm of those shadows. And Hopper's so conscious of the layout and the design of these shadows, which create, again, it's not just a mere literal or photographic impression of something. It's between the scale and the shape. It's a design that produces a harmony of the elements. That's, it's as much an abstract composition as a Mondrian, and yet it's got a lot of complexity to it that Hopper elicits from the inspiration of a visually recognizable subject. We all see the same lighthouse, but we probably would never emphasize or compose it in a picture as he would. He has a very, very distinctive hand in terms of But the ultimate expression is this one. I've spent a lot of time with this painting early Sunday morning. How many of you visited the new Whitney Museum, the brand new building? Do you recall seeing this on I think it's the 8th floor, 7th, I think it's the 7th floor. You start up on the top, you've got Marsden Hartley and the modernists are up on the very top. I found that very peculiar. I thought American art started with the realists. But what happens is you see them downstairs in the room with Mrs. Whitney. And what they were saying there is that in 1913, the Ashcan School painters, you've all heard of the Armory show of 1913? Now, Hopper actually was in that show and sold one work for $250 to a collector whose family is still around today. And that was the only sale that he made of an oil until the mid-1920s. And his next big sale was the watercolor he made of Helen Hayes' house, Pretty Penny, that it was in a show at the Brooklyn Museum that Joe Hopper, Hopper's soon-to-be wife, helped arrange. That painting was sold for $100. And if you think that you or your grandparents would have been avidly lying in wait for the opportunity to buy a Hopper for $250 or $100 back in the day, that was actually, he put a very respectable price on his work for that time. He had a sense that he wasn't just a run-of-the-mill person. He didn't get that kind of money for his illustrations. And that was pretty substantial back then. But I'm leading up to early Sunday morning with the talk about Mrs. Whitney and all of that, because this painting was one of the first to be acquired by the new Whitney Museum in 1934. And I ask you that question, have you been to the new Whitney? Because this piece was undoubtedly the most popular thing there. It's fascinating when I go to these museums and they fuss with such huge space on contemporary art. If you go, the bulk of the square footage in that show was the 5th and 6th floor, where they had massive works of contemporary art. And yet, where was the public? Huddled together, like Stieglitz's photo of steerage. And they were all congregating around this painting and similar paintings of this ilk. And the reason why they jumped, I don't like to leave things altogether hanging, the reason why they jumped in the installation at the Whitney, right from Mrs. Whitney down below, who had in the room with her plenty of Hopper. There was a whole wall of Hopper in there. She had John Sloan, she had Robert Henry, she had George Bellows, she had Luke's, she had the 8, the Ashcan School, and their affiliates, and she also had this sort of novel, sort of folk art modernism, which was another thing she collected. And yet, when they start the story of American art, they're starting it not with Hopper, which would be sort of logical, going directly from Mrs. Whitney, but they interrupt it. They interrupt it in 1913 with the Armory show. The Armory, this is significant because it plays into Hopper versus what comes next. The Armory show was organized by Alfred Maurer and Max Weber, and I can't think of the names of all the other people, but they tended to be affiliates with the Ashcan School, who broadened out to an understanding of European art. They were the bridge artists between the European moderns and the Ashcan. They put in Picasso, Matisse, Henri Rousseau, Van Gogh, and they blended that all together with the Ashcan artists, thinking that they would elevate themselves by the context of what was new. It completely backfired. What happened was, while the moderns did not necessarily gain much in the way of a financial reward, except for the Europeans, who started to be more intensely collected, but it made the Ashcan artists questionable as being the viable avant-garde. Suddenly people were saying, well, what about this cubism and fauvism and all of that? Are the realists actually where it's at? So they had to give up some of the room on center stage to the modernists, who ultimately were sponsored by Stieglitz and his gallery. So you had really two sides of art going on at the same time. And they called that show America is Hard to See. And the reason why is you couldn't make normally a straight line right into abstraction through realism. They were happening at the same time. This painting, The Early Sunday Morning, is a terrific example of somebody who is doing a modernist painting with the means of realism. And I think if you study that painting, first of all, I think we all agree to disagree, because everyone can put their own interpretation on this painting. I've had people vociferously claiming it's the most anxiety-ridden and lonely painting they've ever seen, and then I had another one saying it's like going out early on Sunday morning for the bagels. Anything, the things haven't started yet. And a funny thing, Early Sunday Morning was not the original title either. It was just sun on, I think he called it 7th Avenue Shopfronts was the first name of it. And he said it's all about the sun on the buildings. They've created scale models of this to see if the shadows actually make sense. It's not provable that they do. In Hopper, they mostly make sense, but not exactly. He would allow a little bit of exaggeration here and there to make a visual point. And a couple of the things that happen, you have a big, look at the bottom of the buildings, and look at the base of the barbershop pole. Now you see the way the barbershop pole has a shadow, very much blue, picking up the ambient light of the bottom of that, and how that's a horizontal. Look at the line right below it. Tell me where that's coming from. Nowhere. You might say it's a telephone pole or something else that's off the scene, but it also may be, in a way, it probably was something like there, but for the artist to continue it right across the composition, that's his decision to do that. Likewise, the fire hydrant in the foreground, that has its own shadow, and then below that you have the curb where the sidewalk meets the street, and another line is established there. Look at all the horizontals. You've got the cornice separating the first floor from the second floor of the building. That's got about 3 or 4 vertical bars across it. Then you go to the cornice at the roof line. You have straight across for the top, but the bottom of it is interrupted by those corbels, each of which produces some shadow. And then you'll have 2 intriguing elements. Look at the doorway to the left and the doorway to the right, and you'll see that there's a hanging sign over both of them. One of them has a little triangular support from which it's hanging. The other one has a bar. Both of them create diagonal shadows which cut across the windows. One of the things that Hopper did to keep the meaning of this painting potentially in play was to not explicitly tell you the name of each and every store. So we don't know whether it's a laundry or a coffee shop or a drugstore or whatever. In some cases, there's a famous painting by Hopper, X-Lax. It's indisputable. It's a drugstore. Chop Suey. It's a restaurant. Here, he left it open. And the best of them, the most popular, have that participatory quality. The other thing about this painting is the fact that all of the apertures, the openings of these buildings always in a way become equivalents of eyes. They become very expressive. And it's also a way in which you penetrate as a viewer the experience of the interior space. So look at how each one of them is differentiated. Different type of shades, different level of shades. Different things happen to the design because of the way diagonal shadows cut across. In some of them, look at the two windows to the right. We look above and we think either this place has been a little bit abandoned or someone very poor lives in there because they don't have a proper shade or curtains. They're hanging a piece of cloth like a dish rag or something, or an old sheet or something hung from a rod where otherwise you'd have a shade or a window. So you'll learn something by inference. Even if you don't think about it, you feel it, the possibilities of what's going on in these buildings. The specific of the site, no one really knows. Now, he gave us the clue, 7th Avenue shop fronts there actually were around 26th or 27th Street, but it's not possible to really say, might not this have been a row of stores in a village upstate along the Hudson? It could be. It could be a lot of other areas in Manhattan, from the East Village going more or less anywhere throughout Manhattan. It's sort of universal. And another thing that's very peculiar, tell me, what is that black square on the upper right? You see what that it starts out, it's a piece of another building in shadow. But Hopper didn't have to put that there. I could have left it out completely. But it would mean something else as a painting. We would experience it very differently, because what that does, it brings the sky frontal. And that's the whole thing about this painting. Its modernity is that frontality. And then, of course, these storytelling paintings. Room in New York. Now, remember, we'll get into this in a moment, but Hopper and his wife were a couple. So the interaction between man and woman, the relative independence of their pursuits becomes analogous to Hopper's own experience. This one, in a way, is a little more rigid, a little bit more masculine. The rounded elements seem to be a little bit suppressed in this painting. But one of the most famous is New York Movie of 1939, in which you have the implication of a black and white movie screen on the left. You have the interior of the movie palace. Those of us who have some awareness of the Great Depression know that movie theaters were the retreat from the tough circumstances of everyday life and the opportunity to live a fantasy life elsewhere. And to that end, we see a female protagonist to the right. This has always been interpreted, oddly enough, Hopper would probably be rolling in his grave hearing this, as an Annunciation scene because of the light on this woman. People, the things people come up with on these paintings. Hopper staged this one really as a study of space and environment and interiority, different levels of interior space are all deployed there, and the light source from above and around this woman, and the curtains, the sense of mystery of that staircase in between. I don't think anybody's ever composed a painting like this, and I think that its interest arises from all of these abstract components that trigger our association. Cape Cod Evening, again, the Hoppers, after one of Hopper's big sales of a painting in which he got something like 1,500 or 2,000, I think he'd sold out one of his gallery shows in the 30s. He did well throughout the Depression, and they bought a car. They bought a nice new car, and they see the USA. So they would typically go to Vermont a little bit, and they built the house on Cape Cod. Joe Hopper was always grudging about that house, saying it was Eddie's house. The whole thing was a studio. And this is one of the most famous that's in the Museum of Modern Art, which gave Hopper a one-person show in 1935. He was one of the first artists to be collected by the Museum of Modern Art. And his backer was Alfred Barr, who was the same person responsible for Miro and Chagall and Matisse and Picasso and all of that. Hopper was his American modernist. And again, you have that abstract element of the gasoline tanks with their circular element above, the signage, which the pop artists actually used, one or two of them actually used the Mobil Gas logo, and then the architecture with the cupola. One of the very typical things that Hopper likes are these architectural peculiarities. One of his most famous paintings is Office at Night. And in that one, the fact that there is a bit of tension is everywhere in the painting through the composition, the high angle above which you view it, the shapely woman, modeled like all the girls in Hopper's paintings by his wife Jo, and the man at his desk, of whom we are wondering, is he deliberately trying to keep his eyes from straying to look at the shapely form of the woman working at the file cabinet? Hopper is unquestionably aware of this. And then another one of the greats is his Nighthawks of 1942. And in Gail Levin's book on Hopper, we're privy to the conversation between Joe and Eddie about this painting, and we also get a sense of, he said it was a point on Greenwich Avenue where two streets met at a sharp angle, and there was a coffee shop right there at that corner. This has been researched. There are 3 or 4 architectural settings that are contenders. No one has established for sure where it is, but certain things are peculiar about it to suggest it's a type of a fiction. Because if you look behind it, I'm going to have to backtrack. You've seen that building before, right? There it is. See? And they don't match up. 7th Avenue and 27th Street are not especially near Greenwich Avenue at that point. So here we are at Nighthawks, and both Edward Hopper and his wife posed, Edward Hopper in a mirror, posed for both of the male figures whom he drew from looking at himself in the mirror, and that's, in fact, all 3 male figures he posed for. And summer evening, again, relations between male and female, and this sort of muscular fellow, an attractive young woman, posed by a couple who are now towards 70 or thereabouts. And this is the way Hopper worked. Jo would allow him no models other than herself. And whether there was a little cosmetic surgery or whatever, a product of the imagination, he did what he needed to do to make everybody harmoniously. What I love about this is the mystery of that open window right on the sea, and the fact there's nobody in this room. And there's going to be another famous one coming up. The morning sun, very similar. Again, that light coming in from the right, flooding the scene. And one of my favorites is second-story sunlight, because here you have a scene in which you have old age and youth, and you can see she's just ready to leap out to see the boyfriend coming up in his convertible. And while mom or grandmother is sort of keeping the notion, you've all seen this, well, why don't you stay and visit longer kind of thing. And then finally, the sun in an empty room, which is the one that always evokes comparisons to Rothko and all of that. So a few surrounding details. Hopper in 1913 acquired the rental of the studio at 3 Washington Square. It is still there. It's owned by NYU. Hopper never moved. And the interior, this is what the interior looks like today. Hopper's easel and his etching press. And here's Hopper at that easel painting the sunlight in an empty room with Jo in the background, vigilant. And here, early in their relationship, I learned that she was briefly a homeless person. I had no idea. She had come from a little bit of a financially challenged background, but she saw to it, very self-motivated, educated, trained as a school teacher, worked as a school teacher for about 8 or 9 years, volunteered for the ambulance corps in World War I, and when she came out, she couldn't get a job. She was in the Church of the Ascension crying her eyes out, and the minister saw her there and gave her a place to stay in the church until she could get it together. And about a year later, she was teaching, and she was an amateur actress, and she also had studied art and had posed for Robert Henry. And she started going to the artists' colonies on her 2-week vacation and staying in a rooming house. And she met Edward Hopper in Gloucester. He romanced her for about a year. They were married in the late 20s, which makes he's probably about 42 when they marry, and she's about 7 years younger. And this is Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, painted by the unlikely artist to do such a painting of this type, Robert Henry. She's painted in a Chinese modernist outfit. This is 1916, and if you know fashion history, you know the bustle wasn't completely outmoded by then, and women wearing pants were not exactly a commonplace. And when Harry Payne Whitney saw this painting, he said, "This will not be displayed in my house," which was the all-white marble building, which is now the French Cultural Services on 79th Street and 5th Avenue, where that wonderful bookshop there now. And she then displayed this in the Whitney Studio Club, where she had her artist friends around her. And this is the first Whitney Museum of Art, which arose when Edward Robinson, the director of the Met, refused her donation of 500 paintings. Juliana Force, Mrs. Whitney's curator, visited the Met director and said, "I want to give you these 500 paintings by the likes of Robert Henry through Hopper." And he said to her, "Dear lady, why would we want these things? Our basement is already full of them." So then she decided not to tell that Mrs. Whitney also was giving $5 million with the painting. So she went back to Mrs. Whitney and she said, "You know, the response there wasn't great. Why don't we do it ourselves?" So Mrs. Whitney bought yet another townhouse on 8th Street, 8 West 8th, and she created, adjacent to the studio club, she created the museum. So these paintings all went into the museum, which today you can visit. It's still there. It is now the New York Studio School, which is an certainly appropriate continuation of that endeavor. The Whitney was committed then to contemporary art and to this day. And among the things they collected, John Sloane's Greenwich Village backyards, perfect example of the ash can school. You know, in the old days, the garbage pails were called ash cans, and these wonderful images of children enthusiastically greeting the snow. Birchfield is often regarded as very close to Hopper, and the modernist element in his work is the way the plants are done in such an imaginative manner. Georgia O'Keeffe. In the recent show at the Whitney, they put her in with the Cubists, the Modernists, and the Regionalists with her New Mexico paintings. Stuart Davis, the child of Matisse and Picasso. You blend Cubism together with bright Matisse colors, and there it is like a pop art collage of Cubist fragments. Paul Cadmus, I said there was a realist side going on, and Hopper was linked with those artists like Cadmus, who painted sailors on shore leave, and if you look carefully, you see they're having a very, very good time. And John Marin, Cubist, and Reginald Marsh, back to the realism, the artist whom Hopper is most often compared with. Gaston Lachaise doing his Art Deco modernism, and I wanted to mention that David Findlay's gallery in New York, David Findlay Gallery, is now representing Lachaise, and they're going to do a big Lachaise show. They are so interested in modernism there, and it's in keeping with what's happening around Hopper all through this time, because his colleagues and friends, they segue off into various original styles, and among them Gorky picks up on the European idea of automatism and biomorphism, by which I mean free association and the rounded forms that come from organic shapes, and putting them together into this abstract configuration leads you right to de Kooning and his gestural painting, which still keeps the figure, and Pollock and his drip and splatter technique, which are much more organized in terms of shape and pattern than I can possibly convey to you in a short time. But do visit, if you can, visit the studio out in East Hampton. It will all then make a great deal of sense. And the artist often paired with Hopper in his lifetime. The two of them were the best-selling artists of their era. Hopper and Wyeth, in 1960-62, their work would sell 50,000 a painting for any reasonably good painting in oil. And Maxfield Parrish, an artist from the golden age of illustration, whom Hopper would have been side by side with early in his career. Norman Rockwell, whom he didn't want to be compared with. And here's a photo of Hopper by Berenice Abbott. It's one of the great classic images of Hopper. And then at the Whitney Museum. Now, Hopper died in 1967. Joe died about a year later. I must say their advance directives were not especially fabulous. They had no children. Hopper suffered from a myriad of ailments that kept him hospitalized on and off for the last 10 years of his life, the last 3 particularly bad. And I didn't mention to you that that studio on 3 Washington Square West was a 5-floor walk-up. I don't know, 72 steps, I understand. Now, they had a bathroom in the hall that they shared with another tenant. Now, understand this. He was getting $50,000 a painting. They were very, very penurious. Their idea of an evening out was to go downstairs to the cafeteria. They had a hot plate. They ate Campbell's soup. And they had no central heating. The heat was a coal stove in one room. Hopper would walk upstairs with the buckets of coal to feed the stove. Now, I hope he didn't continue that when he was 85 years old, but that was the lifestyle. And after he was hospitalized, he walked up those 73 steps to go back to that apartment. There was no such thing there as a luxurious, going to Essex Meadows or something of that nature. This is how he had to handle it. And it was purely this outproduct of his Puritan ancestry and his Dutch lineage and all of this. And he himself attributed these traits to his family background. He just couldn't see to it to spend the money. And incidentally, his sister Marion had died 2 years before, left them the family house, and all of this stuff was pretty much in disarray in terms of who was taking care of what and so on. Joe would, get to doing the taxes sooner or later kind of thing. And at the end, they decided to leave everything to the Whitney Museum. Among the peculiar things that happened was, Joe was an artist, and possibly a pretty good one. Her work was the works that Joe sold to others or were mistaken for Edward Hopper paintings were the ones the Whitney kept. Now, Gail Levin's book says that they discarded them. Amazing, if that's true. Can't say that it is, but that's what I heard. And meantime, the 3,000 works that they do have are their foremost asset. That is the thing that drives visitation there. It's iconic. It's like the Demoiselle d'Avignon by Picasso at the Museum of Modern Art, or the Starry Night. That's the painting. If you go to MoMA, on I think it's the 5th floor, where is everybody? The Impressionist room and the next room after it. 99% of the visitation, of course I'm exaggerating, but they are packed in there, and then they gradually filter out from there. And the same story is with Hopper. When the Whitney does a Hopper retrospective, it's a blockbuster. No matter what they call it or how they frame it, that's what people want to see. Why the magic of Hopper? We can all speculate on this, but I think when he says he wanted to paint himself, I think he was really saying he painted all of us, because when we step into those paintings, we all know we're on home territory. We may not necessarily like being there, but we know we've been in that spot or in that mood or in that mindset, and I think that's the great communication that he affords. His immortality is in that. So I thank you, everybody. I'm ready for questions, but I know I don't want to stand in the way of your cocktail hour and all of that.
I can help with the questions.
Sure. Incidentally, question is, did Hopper sign his paintings? Yes, he kept it. He did both. Most of them are signed on the front. I have seen some that are not signed. And the typical practice for artists in those days is certainly when a painting went into exhibition, they tended to sign it. But I have also seen a lot that are not signed. And I think that Hopper's sense of abstraction keeps the signature to a minimum. So where it interferes with the design, he doesn't have it. On a lot of the key paintings, you don't have it. Yes. And I will repeat questions. Oh, and by the way, the journal, extensive. He had stock books, notebooks. He had, for a given painting, he would have sometimes a dozen different or more pen and ink or pencil drawings, which were never intended for the public to see. And he also kept meticulous records of the price and the sale to whom, even for prints. Next.
Would you comment a little bit on his landscaping that he did when he spent some time on the Mohegan Island?
Yeah, he is the land. I think that we think about Hopper's works in clusters, and landscaping is definitely a big piece of it. And his images of Maine are very close to him because he was a sailor and a boat builder, and he loved coastal topography. He spent a lot of time in Maine. He spent a lot of time in the coastal area north of Boston. He loved that part of the world. He's interested in the contrast between the pine trees, the rocks, the beach, the water, and he loves to portray sailboats in action. He built a couple of sailboats in his youth and was a very good sailor. Yes. Yes, in the middle.
Yes. So, of course, you use the word abstraction. Do art historians also use the word surrealism?
Very good question. There is a group they call the American Surrealists, and when they did the display at the Whitney Museum, they had examples of 7 or 8 of them, including Man Ray, whom they displayed not too far away from Hopper. The confusion, in fact, they had Hopper next to George Tooker, and that group from Tooker, Cadmus, and French, they're called the American Surrealists. There's another name for them. There are some that are much wilder, more like Salvador Dali. And their mode of surrealism, I can think of other names, is something akin to magic realism. They do a very heightened type of crisp, dreamlike realism to portray scenes that are not precisely comprehensible, things that don't make sense visually or don't make sense experientially, that could happen in a dream. Hopper is normally not linked except peripherally to these groups, because I think that what we sense with Hopper is more of a transcendental or metaphysical or dreamlike mood that might suggest an unreality or an irreality. But it's not overtly surrealistic, which is usually fraught with complex symbolic dream images, and he would not have linked up with those artists socially or ideologically. But people do see an affinity. And especially with paintings that are so open-ended, they feel it, but it's not quite the same thing. What next?
Did Hopper use any techniques such as obscura or photography?
That's a debatable issue. I don't believe he ever used camera obscura is a way like working with an opaque projector. You feed it, I mean, in a sense, it's more complicated than that, but the simple way of looking at it is a projected and a traced image, and the technology to do this far antedates photography as we understand it, and reputedly was used by Vermeer and various other masters. David Hockney has written extensively. He did a tome to explain. It's been used by artists through the ages and so on. We also know artists like Degas, not normally thought of as someone relying on photographs, did use photographic sources for a lot of his work. So did Gauguin. I have to say I cannot exclude it, and a lifetime familiarity of Hopper and his work, I couldn't think of any concrete example. I do know people run around and photograph things of Hopper sites, but I don't know that he necessarily worked from photos. An argument about that was once introduced about early Sunday morning because the playwright Elmer Rice did a play called Street Scene, and someone introduced a photo of the stage set and that Hopper was looking at this. But whether, an out-and-out copy of a photograph, I don't think so, or reliance on a photo. I can't imagine that he did not have a camera or use it, though. So I think your question has, it may provide an avenue of investigation for somebody, but I would say, so far as I know, wouldn't be a big feature of it, at a minimum. Yes. Roy Grant. Thank you.
You pointed out early on that the source of light in many of his paintings was from this side.
I mostly that I'm seeing, yeah.
Though not the one in Trour, was it? He lived on the west side of the Hudson in Nyack. And so he would have been obsessed, as I was when I lived along the Hudson, with the river itself.
Mm-hmm.
So a person who built his house there,
You're absolutely right. You're going to be facing...
Yes. And it
Mm-hmm.
was striking in the picture of the woman sewing, because the river was
Mm-hmm.
out there,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
out the window.
Right.
And in other words, I have one other comment. You have the painting, you showed the painting of the chop suey. I've been in more Chinese restaurants than I would care to remember. But there's no sign of Chinese food in that restaurant. There's no grease on the tables, anything fallen on the floor. No soy sauce, no litter, no chop suey. So that is striking.
Well, I think Hopper, I must tell you, on the subject of Chinese restaurants, one of the most famous, I will address this, but one of the most famous contemporaneous paintings is by Max Weber. It's called Dinner in a Chinese Restaurant. And you do see some chopsticks furiously being manipulated, if you care to view these white things as chopsticks. And you see you see a characteristic floor, you see a red interior, you see all the hallmarks of the classic Chinatown restaurant. And I was thinking with the chop suey that this is a second floor space, that you would have gone up a flight of stairs, which is certainly not impossible. In fact, perhaps likely when you consider, the custom of, restaurants a little above or a little below, it sort of fits. But Hopper's not a meticulous realist. I don't think, it may have been a composite and not really a Chinese restaurant. Is another feature of it. It's clearly some type of a gathering place with tables, but nothing's on the table. And the fellow who's in the background, if it was today, he'd be on his iPhone. He seems to be doing something other than eating. He's looking at a paper or something. And so I think what that points to me is the fact that, again, like an illustrator engages in fictions, puts together things, ingredients that make a point that they want to make. And I guess in his case, the chop suey was a sufficient signal that that's what catches your eye, and you probably think Chinese restaurant, you think two flappers out getting together and they're going to have a meal. You don't really think too much beyond it, except you did. And there you go. So,
One more question.
yes.
Just here?
I just wanted to know what material they used. Were they oil paints?
Yes, he used oil paints. And Winsor & Newton and pre-primed canvases, which I wonder whether the ones you get are as good. I know you can buy Winsor & Newton oils today, but I don't know whether Winsor & Newton makes primed canvases. You know, all of these companies, a lot of them have all been consolidated. And if you're an artist, you realize you don't go to Perrell Paint, you don't go to Utrecht, you go to Dick Blick. You know, it's like McDonald's. It's like, it's fine, but they put everybody else out of business, and you know, they've homogenized it to a great extent. And you know, he said, I trust Winsor & Newton. Well, he said that back in 47 or 45 or whatever, and here we are 70 years later, and it begs the question, you know, is Winsor & Newton or anybody else the same thing as they were then? So who knows? I do know they still make pretty good oil paint, and that's what he used. Oh, and the other thing he said, lead white versus zinc white. Now this is strange. Anybody here a painter? You can look this up in Hopper's biography. He says that zinc white tends to crack. He uses lead white. I use zinc white. I didn't know. It's a new one on me. But there it is. Yes.
Lead white yellows.
Yeah, lead white yellows. That's why I'd heard that. That's why I don't use it. So, yeah, exactly. So back, I guess that'll be one more because you've got some sort of refreshments ahead. So, yeah.
I was just wondering, since we're in the New York area, and a lot of people here seem like they might be old enough, whether anybody had any personal encounter with Hopper.
Good question. As far as people living today, I noticed in the credits of one of the books, there is an art historian named Barbara Novak who was present at Hopper's funeral in '67, and she's still around. So I think she knew Hopper. '67 is not that long ago, so I think there are people around who knew him. But his big friend was a man named Lloyd Goodrich, who's also deceased. People here today. Is there anyone present here who volunteers that they knew Hopper? I know you know his house. His house, incidentally, that Hopper house, by the way, that's a very good question. I wonder if I knew Hopper. Don't remember. In any event, I'm certainly old enough, but the house that's on the Hudson is a place, they're open, I think, Wednesday through Sunday, something like that. They maintain and perhaps show you some educational display and archives about Hopper, but they use it more as a community art center with a gallery. And I, having been a historic preservationist, I was very amused at their ad hoc efforts to restore that house. If you go to their website, they'll tell you how they pulled it together. I don't think they did a bad job at all. I haven't actually been there. But from what they say, people just sort of getting together and, you know, refurbishing an old house. They knew, here's the story that I thought was great. All the people on the board took home the wood windows. And somebody told them, each one of them, they had a class, how do you refinish them? And they all brought them back, perfect. I thought that's pretty good. Okay, thank you.